Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The presidents of Russia and the United States have had their historic phone call. By all accounts, restoring this bilateral relationship has started. Putin and Trump want this, but will it happen? To Crosstalk Russia-U.S. relations, I'm joined by my guest here in Moscow, Edward Lazansky. He's the president of the American University in Moscow. We also have Dmitry Babich. He is a political analyst with Sputnik International. And in London, we cross to Alexander Mikiris. He is the editor-in-chief of the Duran.com. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Alex, let me go to you first in London. Well, we had the phone call, pretty much what we expected here. Both sides seemed satisfied with it from the official statements coming out of the Kremlin and the White House. What is the most important takeaway that you took from it?
For me, the two most interesting things about the phone call was firstly that it was an hour long. That is a long telephone call for two very busy men. The other thing was these extremely warm words that Donald Trump extended on behalf of the American people to the Russian people. That was not expected by me, and it's not really very usual in these sort of conversations. And it was unusually warm thing to say. Now, the two leaders covered an awful lot of ground. They talked about Korea, they talked about the Middle East, they talked about the Ukraine, they talked about bilateral relations, they talked about the fight against ISIS, and I think we're going to hear a lot about that. They also spoke importantly about restoring their trade and economic relations and taking them up to a new level. I think these are the most important two things.
You know, Ed, you know, you're the one of two people that have come on Crosstalk over the last 18 months that got the election result right, and you predicted it a long time ago. You and Gilbert Doctorow. And you're a Russian. You live in the United States. You fought very hard to have a good, both these countries have a good relationship. What was your takeaway from the conversation? Because I want to talk about sanctions here and how the media gets it wrong. Go ahead.
Well, in general, of course, it was good, but I expected more.
Okay.
Usually, when heads of state meet, they come up with some kind of a gift, a presents.
Well, they probably will when they meet in person.
Yeah,
yes.
well,
okay.
They could do it even during this conversation. What I was looking forward is that for Putin and Trump make some gestures which will really set up the positive agenda. Let me be a little bit more specific. For Trump, it was very easy simply to remove some of the sanctions which were imposed by Obama on December, I think, 29, something like that. One thing was simply to give back those dachas. You know, for Russians, dacha is...
You're talking for the embassy staff in the United States.
Right. And for the children, you know, and this would be easy for you.
Well, I think that this, you know, Dima, you know, jump in here, because we all have to speak realistically here now, because of what the Obama administration did in its waning days, is that if Trump were to sign an executive order along the lines that Ed just mentioned, then he's caving in to Putin. This is what he has to avoid. And that's probably, Ed, why he didn't do it.
Yeah, but not to Putin, to children.
Okay, I agree. Okay, fine. Go ahead.
Well, let's not forget, the people who wage this nasty campaign against Trump in 90% of the American media, these people are not satisfied. They're going to continue.
They will never be satisfied.
Yes,
okay.
I think what we see now in the United States is very interesting. The same technologies that were used against President Yanukovych of Ukraine, against Slobodan Milosevic in the former Yugoslavia.
So forced regime change comes home.
Yes, it comes home, and these people are out there to try to topple Trump by any means during the next 4 years. So Trump has to keep it in his mind, and he will not make any dramatic moves on the Russian front in the foreseeable future.
I think
because you know, there's an old diplomatic saying about it. If you throw a frog into the boiling water, it's going to jump out. If you do it slowly and steadily, you're probably going to boil it.
Okay, well, that's not good for the frog. Alex, let me go back to you in London. One of the interesting things that's been brought up in the media, which I think is completely wrong, is the issue of sanctions. Number one, our viewers should understand Russia sees these sanctions because of Ukraine as illegitimate. And they're not good. That's not going to be a bargaining chip at all. Another issue is that I think my major takeaway from it all is that they have to start thinking strategically. Not this point, not that point. They have to have an overall strategic security understanding, and that includes NATO, and that includes, as Trump has said over and over again, he wants to work with Russia to destroy ISIS in the Middle East. These are the two things that I'm going to be looking for. Go ahead, Alex in London.
I think that is exactly right. I don't think it was politically possible for Mr. Trump simply to lift the sanctions in the first telephone call. And I don't think the Russians were expecting that. In fact, they made it very clear a few weeks ago that they were not going to use the subject of sanctions as a hostage to a general improvement in relations between the United States and Russia. I think the Russians are looking for exactly what you said, a understanding with the United States about the entire relationship.
Right.
And this is why you had such a very wide-ranging telephone call between the two presidents. And we should also bear in mind the Russians discussed the telephone call, what Mr. Putin would say. There was a very high-level meeting in Moscow. We know all about it because the Russians have publicized it. So they prepared their ground very carefully.
Right.
They covered all the aspects of their relations in the phone call. They made it clear to Mr. Trump what they wanted from him. I don't think sanctions is high on that agenda at all. They want to work with the United States over ISIS, over terrorism, over establishing, in the end, a much larger relationship.
Dima, do you want to jump in real quick?
I just wanted to say that actually sanctions were not that bad for the Russian economy.
Exactly. This is exaggerated by the mainstream media all the time.
These people who fight against Trump, they have been lying for so many years. And Trump's moves may appear now to be radical precisely because people in the United States have been living in that box of lies for so many years. I mean, the idea that there should be order on the border with Mexico. They say, like, Trump is against Mexico. Well, 45,000 people died in Mexico in the so-called war on drugs since before 2011, maybe a few thousand more afterwards. That all happened under Obama, under George Bush the Jr., and now when Trump suddenly wants to change it, they say he's against Mexico. The people who started this war on drugs in Mexico, they are against Mexico, and they were American officials.
You know, and one of the things I think is really interesting, if we start parsing what Trump has said during the campaign and since he's been in office, is that the issue of Syria itself has gone down in magnitude, and Ukraine. Now, think about it. A great deal of the tension that the United States and Russia have are over Ukraine and Syria. And as I've said on this program before, if Trump doesn't think it's important, he pushes it aside and focuses on what he thinks is important. I think this is really good for Syria, and maybe we even had the British Prime Minister Theresa May saying that the Minsk Accords should be implemented, and that means Kiev has to do something, not Russia. Go ahead, Ed.
Well, I think both Syria and Ukraine issues can be resolved in U.S.-Russia work together.
Of course.
It was known since it started. First of all, U.S. started this mess in both countries, I think. And we already had some positive signals, at least in Syria. We know that the U.S. delegation, although was not very high ranking because Tillerson
it's still a transition.
Tulsi Gabbard went there.
It's good signal that, and so I think the same with Ukraine. If Washington tells Ukrainians just that you have to regime, right? You have to really fulfill this Minsk agreement. Then they will have to have no choice. I think what we also had to do is to do audit. We spent so much money, IMF, World Bank, American taxpayers' money on Ukraine. We know that some of it, if not most of it, was stolen.
Well, of course,
we
it's
need
Ukraine.
Audit.
Okay.
We need audit. But I want also to mention something what I expected from Putin, because I mentioned about Dacia, which I still think it was a good gesture without jeopardizing U.S. security or anything like that. I know I have Dacia myself. If someone take Dacia from me,
Yeah,
I'll
Dacia.
give it
Okay,
away.
and I'm sorry.
Viewers, it's a Russia thing. It's a
There is
Russia
a
thing.
much
Okay.
more dramatic thing.
But
I'm
let
sorry,
me-
but there is a much more dramatic thing going on in Ukraine right now. Right now, people are having their homes, not daches, destroyed in Debaltsevo, in other places that the Ukrainian regime is slowly taking for itself. So I think the people in the United States and people in France and Germany, when they hear Russia should fulfill Minsk agreements, they should read these 2 pages of text. And it's very easy. Ukraine, before Russia does
Exactly.
anything, Ukraine is supposed to give
Dima,
special status to these areas, which they didn't do.
People always talk about these Minsk Accords, but they never read them. I suggest that viewers Google it. Alex, in London, weigh in on that, because if you're Mr. Poroshenko right now in Kiev, you probably are a little nervous, wouldn't you think?
I think they're extremely nervous. I'm afraid the problem with the Ukraine is that whenever the government and the people there feel nervous, what they invariably do is they become more aggressive. And I think that's going to be a major problem, because that is not just an emotional calculation on their part. I think there is a political calculation that if they can aggravate the situation, that will rally support to them in Europe and in the United States.
And
And
that's
we
a huge
must
danger.
understand if
Well,
we can...
that's a huge danger, because
It's
this
a
is one of
huge
the
danger.
ways Clinton supporters may try to undermine Trump. If there is another war in Ukraine and he has to react, that can jeopardize the U.S.-Russia relations, and that can help them topple
again,
him.
I want to stress to our viewers again and again, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and the United States and NATO countries are not obliged to come to its defense. It is not a member of the treaty.
And just recently, the most powerful candidate for French presidency, François Fillon, said it was a mistake to invite
Dima, let me
Ukraine
jump
in
in here.
2008.
I have to go to a
Mistake.
hard break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Russia-U.S. relations. Stay with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing Russia-U.S. relations. Okay, here in my hands I have Donald Trump and I have Vladimir Putin. Now, Ed, what should Vladimir Putin be doing to improve U.S.-Russia relations?
Well, during this conversation, I think what Putin could have done is to offer help in bringing China into the fold. Because Trump is just said during the campaign and over, he wants to be friends with every country which wants to have good relations with the United States. Also, he is looking for allies in the war of terror. So far, China is kind of in the back. And China, so far as we know, doesn't do too much in this. If Putin could tell Trump that he will take into account his close relationship with Xi Jinping, he'll try to bring China to the table and maybe have a summit of 3 when they will discuss how to bring China and the United States and Russia in this global war on terror.
You know, it's interesting you mention that, because Dima, there's the old mantra. You know, we go back to the age of Kissinger and Nixon, and I've heard in looking at some of the think tank stuff is that the U.S. should appeal to Russia to turn away from China and have some kind of condominium, which I think is really nonsense, because of one important issue. Is that for the last 25 years, the level of trust between Moscow and Washington is gone zero, if not negative, because of the issue of trust.
Exactly. And the level of trust between Russia and Beijing went up.
Yes.
Not because Chinese are so friendly or we fell in love with China, but because Obama led such terrible policy. He pushed us towards each other. So when people now say that Trump is going to ruin U.S.-China relationship, Obama already ruined it.
Right.
during the last few years. In the same way, when I hear accusations that Trump is not allowing refugees from Iraq and from Syria to come to the United States, Obama ruined Iraq together with George Bush the Jr., first by the invasion, then by allowing the so-called Islamic State to take Mosul. Note, we have nothing about Mosul in the last few days, okay? And we don't hear anything also.
Well, Syria's dropped out because, because they didn't get the outcome they wanted, while in Kazakhstan, they're starting the very hard process of rebuilding that country.
The truth is surfacing little by little. Okay, Trump said that Obama created the ISIS. That may be an exaggeration. But right now in Russia, my colleague Elena Suponina from RIA, she published the facts that the Iraqi vice premier, Hoshyar Zabari, told her that in 2014, when the ISIS was expanding in Iraq, when they took Mosul and al-Maliki asked for help from the United States, he didn't get it. So Russia helped Iraq, and this is the reason why the Iraqis helped Russians to have our aviation in Syria.
Let me go back to Alex in London. Both presidents have talked about fighting terrorism, and now we have a sitting president that is reaching out the hand. I mean, this is a significant move because, like I said in the beginning of the program, I don't think, lifting sanctions, giving back the dachas, that's not going to be what's really important right here. Is that, Trump is transactional. He wants to see something happen, cause and effect. Go work with Russia, get rid of ISIS in Syria and in Iraq, and then that creates an atmosphere, an environment, an architecture, if you will, to start rebuilding this relationship. And they better not use the word reset. Please, go ahead.
Yes, I think you've explained it extremely well, actually, because, of course, fighting ISIS is something that is so obviously in the joint interests of both countries. And it is relatively straightforward to do. I say relatively because nothing is ever straightforward in the relationship between Russia and the United States. Right. But to the extent that anything is straightforward, this is. If they can do it together and they can do it well, and there's no reason why they can't, then they can move on to more contentious issues. Can I just say one thing?
Go ahead,
which
Jim.
is this. If we're talking about Russia and the United States, there is always a fundamental asymmetry in the relationship between these two countries. Russia always wants better relations with the United States. In the United States, there are always some people who do not want better relations with Russia.
Too many.
Too many people. And that, unfortunately, sometimes means that the Russians in the past have felt that they have had to go the extra mile to win those people over. I think they're going to be very reluctant to do that this time. So this has to be taken slowly. It's the only way.
And you've always been a real booster for U.S.-Russia relations. You have a long career in it, and it's commendable. But I'm more of a realist here. I don't think the United States and Russia are going to be particularly good friends, okay? They have different national interests. As I said, sitting at this table, when the election result was announced, is that my wish list is minimalist. We should hope for, at the very least, a lowering of tension, lowering of the rhetoric, and looking for places that they can work together. Only then can you talk about some kind of solid, trusted, believable relationship.
Well, if you talk about government, yes, probably you're right that friendship or allies, it's probably impossible. When you talk to people, then people are friendly already. We don't have to do anything. Yeah. American and Russian people are friendly. But what worries me in this situation is not only the swamp which Trump promised to drain, and I wish him all the best to drain the swamp.
Victoria Nuland's gone, thank goodness.
Well, it's just a small piece of it. But I'm worried about Kissinger, just exactly that we mentioned China, because Kissinger, with all due respect to him, he will try probably to convince Trump to work with Russia against China.
It's not going to happen.
And this is impossible.
It's not going to happen.
So that's why I will come back to my previous idea that I wanted Putin to mention to Trump. Let's have a meeting of three. Unless China, Russia, and the United States work on the same kind of wavelengths, I don't think we'll have security.
There's one little problem with that. It's the South China Sea, okay?
Well,
we have to see how
it
that
can be
goes.
resolved.
It will be resolved. I don't think that Washington's going to be happy with the result, but it will be resolved. Go ahead.
Well,
Nina.
I think that we should not forget about Europe here also,
Okay.
because it's very interesting what is going on there. I mean, who are the people who are against Trump and who are stubbornly suggesting that Trump should continue fighting Putin? These are people on their way out. Hollande, in his phone conversation with Trump, said that Russia should first fulfill the Minsk agreements as if Ukraine had been fulfilling them, right? Merkel keeps saying that it is dangerous, we have a new epoch beginning, America is basically has gone mad. But Merkel and Hollande, basically they're people, I hope, they're on their way out. What is very interesting, we see Theresa May, who suddenly says, the United States and the UK, the times when we were in the business of remaking countries in our own image, these times are gone. Well, that's a miracle from her, right? Boris Johnson says, we have been saying that mantra, Assad must go, and we were unable to make that happen. Well, what a revelation. So, the problem is that we're not, the Russian people and even the Russian state has no problem with the United States as a partner, as a state. I think the problem is this ideology of ultra-liberalism, Western domination.
Let's stay with ideology. Alex, back in London, one thing that hasn't been mentioned here, but was one of the takeaways I got from the phone call, is that the notion of American exceptionalism kind of vanished, at least maybe evaporated for a short while. That's a breath of fresh air. Go ahead.
It's very striking. If you look at President Trump's various speeches, his inauguration, his recent interviews, he has actually basically dropped all that language. And I think that's actually causing a lot of alarm amongst the true believers in the United States. And we must always understand that these are Mr. Trump's views at the moment. They're the views of certain people in the administration. There is some support for them in the United States. I get the impression the oil industry, for example, in the United States wants better relations with Russia for commercial reasons. But there are an awful lot of very strong, ideologically committed people in the United States who look on all this with horror.
Okay, Alex, of course, because this is how they make a living. An entire career has been made out of this, okay? And then all of a sudden there's a doorstop, and they're going to fight very hard to get it back. Well, all careers are online right now.
We have heard from Mr. Solana and from many ideologues of ultraliberalism in the United States that now Angela Merkel should be the leader of the Western world because Trump is no good. Well, I mean, the fact that Trump dropped the stock of American exceptionalism, it's normal to me, but also the people like Victoria Nuland, thank God, on her way out of the State Department, the fact that Hillary Clinton and others, they all stopped talking about American exceptionalism. Why? Because Americans were exceptional when they voted them into power, when they gave them the means to rule the world. Now that Americans voted for Trump, they're no longer exceptional. So you see that these people, Obama, Hillary, they never cared about the United States. They wanted their ideology to win. And there was a terrible article recently in the Washington Post that praised the Germans because they continue voting for Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, while in the United States and in Britain people vote in different ways.
I think it's very interesting, and I may do a complete program on Steve Bannon, but I think it's very interesting, Ed, and I don't have any evidence, I just have a gut feeling here, is that he's a very, very conservative person, needless to say, and he sees Russia as a conservative country. So there's another dynamic here, not just geopolitics, but a cultural vision as well. I don't know how important it is, but I think it is there.
Value-based.
That's right. Well, values and real values and real culture, and I think that is important here.
It's true, and I think this is a very important factor because we kept hearing from previous folks the swamp, but not indispensable.
Nation.
All this stuff, it's now gone. It's
been decapitated. They're still there, okay? We have to...
The indispensables voted for Trump. They're no longer indispensable.
But at least in this room, which 5 people who spoke with Putin, there were 5 people. 3 were good guys.
Okay, 3 were good guys. We've run out of time, gentlemen. Fascinating discussion. Many thanks to my guests here in Moscow and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.
believe that they will not continue. I love you.